Hello everyone. Today's topic is renal emergencies and palliative medicines. Uh, we will be covering acute kidney injury, acute obstructive uropathy, and hemorrhagic cystitis. Starting with acute kidney injury, I have a case scenario here. It's a 50-year-old female with diabetes, had history of lower back pain since 1 year. She was prescribed diclofenac tablets for the pain 2 months back. She had pain relief with that, so she continued to take it 2 times daily since 2 months. Now she presented with severe pain in flank area, radiating to the thigh, and vomiting since 5 days. She also complains of reduced urine output since 2 days. Her lab investigation shows a creat level of 2.8. Now we all know what exactly is happening here. This is a picture of acute kidney injury, probably precipitated by a renal calculi or maybe dehydration because of vomiting. And also she has a history of intake of NSAIDs. So multiple reasons here. Why do we measure creatinine in acute kidney injury? So creatinine is basically produced by arginine and glycine in liver, our muscles and the kidney. This creatinine is excreted in the circulatory system. It is broken down into creatinine in the muscles. Creatinine is excreted from the kidney and it is not filtered or has no tubular reabsorption. So basically it is excreted as it is from the kidney, and hence it's the best thing through which the kidney functions can be measured. By definition, the kidney disease improvement global outcome has defined AKI as increase in serum creat by 0.3 mg per dl within 24 hours from the baseline, increase in serum creat by 1.5 times the baseline, which has happened within 7 days, or a urine output less than 0.5 ml per kg per hour for at least 6 hours. That was the KDIGO criteria. We have the Rifle criteria for AKI, which is risk, injury, and failure criteria. Now, this classifies the kidney injury as risk, injury, and failure, loss, and end-stage renal disease based on the creat clearance and the urine output. The other thing is the staging. AKI is staged as stage 1, 2, 3. Based on the serum creat and urine output. AKI stage 1 is a serum creat of more than 0.3 milligrams per ml, or an increase to 1.5 from baseline, 1.5 to 1.9. AKI stage 2 is increase in serum creat to 2 to 2.9 times the baseline, and AKI stage 3 is a serum creat of more than 3 times from the baseline, or serum creat of more than 4, or something which requires treatment with renal replacement therapy. Similarly, according to the urine output, stage 1 is urine output of less than 0.5 ml per kg per hour. Stage 2 for 6 to 12 hours. Stage 2 is urine output less than 0.5 ml per kg per hour for more than 12 hours. And stage 3 is urine output of less than 0.3 ml per kg per hour for more than 24 hours, or anuria. What exactly is the mechanism for this renal failure? Like we know, renal failure can be divided into 3 categories. Pre-renal, that is something that has happened before reaching the kidney. Intrarenal, that is something that is happening in the kidney. And post-renal, that is something that is post the kidney. So what happens in pre-renal AKI? So when there is hypotension due to any infection or sepsis or decrease in cardiac output, there is decreased blood flow to the kidney, which causes decreased GFR. This results in AKI. In intrarenal cause, this can be either due to nephrotoxic drugs or bacteria or infection. In this, there is direct injury to the kidney. In post-renal cause, there is obstruction to the urine flow, causing back pressure, causing damage to the kidney. What are some of the causes for acute renal failure? Pre-renal has causes like we explained, as anything that affects the blood volume, that is hemorrhage or volume depletion, or anything that decreases the cardiac output, like congestive heart failure, anything that causes decrease in the blood flow to the renal artery, like occlusion or stenosis, and that's something that causes hemodynamic instability, like medications which include NSAID and ACE inhibitors. The intrinsic or the intrarenal causes include vascular, like vasculitis or malignant hypertension, acute glomerulonephritis, acute interstitial nephritis, and acute tubular necrosis. Now, acute tubular necrosis can either be ischemic or because of nephrotoxic drug. Post-renal cause, like we said, it includes anything that is obstructing the outflow at any level. So it can be bladder or urethral obstruction. Some of the common symptoms that we see in acute kidney failure is reduce in the urine output. That is, of course, included in the diagnostic criteria itself. There can be fatigue, weakness, vomiting. There can be difficulty in breathing. Sometimes the patient may present with confusion. Other thing that can be seen is edema, hypertension. So why exactly do we see all these symptoms? So the cause here is activation of renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So what happens when there is decrease in the renal blood flow, or when there is a kidney injury, there is decreased renal perfusion, causing activation of angiotensin, which is then converted to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 causes a lot of effects, which includes increased sympathetic activity. There is sodium chloride reabsorption and potassium excretion. This leads to salt and water retention. It acts on the adrenal cortex, causing aldosterone secretion, which again leads to salt water retention. There is arteriolar vasoconstriction, which leads to increased blood pressure, causing hypertension. And there is activation of the pituitary gland, which causes ADH secretion, causing again water retention. Water retention, salt retention leads to edema and hypertension here, and a lot of electrolyte imbalance that we see in patients with kidney injury. What exactly will, if a patient presents to us with a picture of increased creatinine, what other investigation should be advised? So we need to get a full blood count to see what is the hemoglobin status, to have a picture about the hemoglobin status. We need to check for the urine microscopy and sediments to look for any intrarenal cause. A serum calcium, because many times hypercalcemia causes renal injury leading to AKI. A renal sonography whenever feasible to look for any obstructive cause, or look for hydronephrosis, or look for chronic changes in the kidney. Other thing will be urine electrolytes and osmolarity, and a complete renal picture, which includes urea and uric acid. Now, based on these investigations, we can further investigate the patient depending on our goals of care. Some of the possible etiology here, which is mentioned, may not be very relevant in palliative care. So we need to understand our goals of care and investigate accordingly. Maybe we can investigate for myeloma or sepsis in our patients and further investigate, further check the blood culture, urine culture, inflammatory markers, and the other electrolytes. So this is a nice chart which I found. It shows the reference, gives us the risk assessment, which helps us in investigating how we can manage and when to refer to a nephrologist. So in risk assessment, we need to look for the age of the patient, what comorbidity the patient has, whether the patient is in acute sepsis or it's post-operative. We need to check for the volume status, look whether the patient is dehydrated, look for the BP, whether hypotensive. Look for all the medication that the patient is on, including NSAID, COX-2 inhibitors, ACE inhibitors, ARB, aminoglycoside, or look if the patient has underwent any scans recently, which involves contrast. When we have established the AKI based on the criteria, we need to investigate further, like we've already discussed. And then our first goal is to optimize the volume by giving boluses of fluid. This boluses of fluid will also help in optimizing the blood pressure. We need to stop medications which are causing harm, like NSAIDs and ACE inhibitors, and maintain adequate urine output in these patients. Now, when to refer to a nephrologist, and refer to a nephrologist even in our setup when we are suspecting any intrarenal cause like glomerulonephritis, when the patient can potentially need renal replacement therapy, or when the AKI has occurred in a transplant patient. Indications for dialysis in a normal population is A, E, I, O, U. A stands for acidosis, E for electrolyte disturbance, usually hyperkalemia, I for intoxication of medications, O for symptoms of overload like severe edema, U for uremia, or when the patient is in uremic attack, has signs and symptoms of that. Indication for dialysis in a patient who is under palliative care will be based on the goals of care and has to be discussed with the family and the patient if the patient is oriented enough. KDIGO has classified the management according to this stage. Initial 7 management should be included in all the stage. That is early detection of AKI, monitoring of the creatinine, of fluid intake and output charting, stopping nephrotoxic drugs, adjusting the medication according to renal clearance, the hemodynamic support that is provided, and if the patient has to undergo a scan, we need to look for what contrast can be used. When the patient is stage 2 AKI, we also need to correct the fluid overload, target the glycemic index according to the baseline, keep a pH of above 7.3, and consider renal replacement therapy if feasible. Now, it's very difficult sometimes to understand if the patient is in acute renal failure or in chronic renal failure because we don't really have the baseline creat for every patient. So here we have a few differences between acute renal failure and chronic renal failure. In acute, the onset is usually over days to weeks, And in chronic, the onset is usually over weeks to months. Acute renal failure may or may not be reversible. Chronic renal failure is usually irreversible. Acute renal failure is mostly pre-renal and has pre-renal or post-renal cause. Chronic renal failure is mostly related to the kidneys. In acute renal failure, since it's acute in onset, oliguria and anuria are common symptoms. In chronic renal failure, we have polyuria because it has affected the uh, glomerulus. So, polyuria is just a symptom for that. In acute renal failure, finding renal cast in urine may be uncommon, whereas in chronic renal failure, it is seen. The urine specific gravity in acute renal failure is high. It is low to flexible in chronic renal failure. Past history of deranged creatinine function is absent in acute renal failure. We have a picture of worsening creatinine in patients with chronic renal failure. Dialysis may be required in acute renal failure. In chronic renal failure, most of the patients are on dialysis. This was about the acute kidney injury. Moving on to the next topic, that is obstructive uropathy. So, obstructive, uh, just a basic anatomy of the kidney. So, we have here, you can see we have in kidney, we have the renal papillae, which secrete urine in the minor calyces, which join to form the major calyces, which merge to form the renal pelvis, and eventually it forms the proximal ureter. The ureter travels inferiorly into the retroperitoneum, passing posteriorly to the bladder and insert in the base of the bladder. The urethra originates at the bladder neck inferior to the urethral orifice in male and is surrounded by the prostate gland in male. So, obstructive uropathy can occur at any level in this entire anatomy. Some of the causes based on the level of obstruction, if the patient, renal causes involve calculi, which is the most common thing, urothelial carcinoma, the ureter, the causes for obstructive uropathy at the level of ureter involves stone, urothelial carcinomas again, extrinsic tumors, infection, retroperitoneal fibrosis, obstructed stents, blood clots, trauma, or ectopic ureter. The causes at the bladder level involves urothelial carcinoma, blood clot, edema, bladder dysfunction, and posterior urethral valve dysfunction. At the level of urethra, the causes can be enlarged prostatic gland, stones, and strictures. Some of the causes related to malignancy involves malignancy of urinary tract, malignancy of the female reproductive system like endometrial and cervical cancers, malignancy of GI tract like gastric cancers, colorectal cancers, primary or secondary malignancy in the retroperitoneal area, retroperitoneal fibrosis, post-chemotherapy or radiation therapy, any anatomotic strictures following urinary diversion, or cancer-related lymphadenopathy. Common signs and symptoms of patients with obstructive uropathy involve pain, change in urine output, hypertension, hematuria, and increased serum creatinine. Now, pain is frequently absent if it's an acute obstruction, and when present, it is usually resulting from bladder distension, secondary infection, or any stones. Hydronephrosis is almost always asymptomatic, and if there is pain in patients who have known hydrouronephrosis, then we should consider either stones or infections or necrosis. Severe pain is seen in renal or ureteral calculi causing obstruction. External ureteral compressions leading to obstruction, the pain is absent because it's slowly progressing. So urine output can be variable in different cases. Like we discussed previously, polyuria can be present even with reduced GFR because of tubular injury, impairment in the ability of the tubules to retain salt and concentrate the urine. In addition, the obstruction can lead to bladder distension, causing overflow incontinence. So in these cases, you can actually see polyuria and not anuria or decreased output. Now, the patient may or may not be hypertensive. It depends on the salt water retention and activation of renin-angiotensin system. Urinary tract infection may or may not be present. Bilateral urinary obstruction can, in the presence of underlying disease, can lead to an increased serum creatinine level. Hematuria with pyuria may or may not be present. Electrolyte imbalance can occur. Most common is hyperkalemia. This is hyperkalemia, distal renal tubular acidosis. This is mostly because of the mineralocorticoid resistance, which impairs the sodium reabsorption, causing derangement in electrolyte function. How do we investigate such patients? Serum, the baseline blood investigation is done, and then we need to consider performing an ultrasonography. It's safe and inexpensive and mostly available. Here you can see this picture of sonography showing, it's a longitudinal section showing the dilation of the renal pelvis and the calyces. The other investigation that can be ordered is a CT scan based on the creatinine level. If the ultrasonography is not able to detect this, CT scan is preferred when we have the cause is related to calculi, as it can be seen better in CT scan. In some cases, retrograde uropathy may be done. Urography can be done. So when we have diagnosed a patient who have hydrouronephrosis, our goal for urinary drainage should be to relieve the symptoms, to maintain renal functions, allowing initiation of systemic therapy, and to minimize further interventions, hospitalization, and to improve the quality of life. So some of the guidelines that we use are NICE and the European Association of Urology. None of the guidelines have stated specifically on the management plan in such patients. NICE guideline says that patients should be offered decompression therapy. These guidelines are mostly for advanced cancer patients, so they should be offered decompression therapy, but the option of no intervention should be discussed with the patient and family. The EAU guidelines say it's a good practice to drain symptomatic hydronephrosis and to drain the kidney, which has a better function and has less dilation, especially in asymptomatic patients. The way which we can manage this patient is either by draining by a percutaneous nephrostomy or by placing stents. So percutaneous nephrostomy, some of the pros of a percutaneous nephrostomy is it's more likely to improve the renal function than stent, and it's better in younger patients who are going to receive chemotherapy. It's simple procedure, done under local anesthesia. However, some of the cons are there is recurrent blockage and dislocation of the tube. The dressing or the site of the insertion can leak and cause infection. It ideally needs to be changed every 3 months. There is increased risk of bleeding, bowel injury, and failure of procedure in percutaneous nephrostomy. This is a picture how it's done. We have the tube which is inserted in the pelvis area of the kidney, and we have a bag which is attached outside. So whatever urine output is there, it's drained in the bag, and the obstruction or the distension is relieved. Now, what about stent? Placing a stent, there are the most important pro is that it is not an external tube or a drain. So the discomfort which the patient faces with a PCN, that is he or she is not able to lie down because there is one or two bag and tube hanging out from the back. This is not there when we advise stenting. However, the cons are this is
Dr. Shamli is facing some internet issues. She will just log in just a few minutes.
sorry, I just got logged off. Where did I stop? I didn't realize when I got logged off. So,
this slide, you were talking about this slide, I think.
So the cons of a stent placement is it needs general anesthesia. It's a more invasive procedure. It needs exchange every 6 to 12 months. And there are chances of repeated blocking of the stent, and it's not very effective in the case of extrinsic compression because of mass or tumor. Also, there is risk of a stent failure of stent insertion, and stent placement is a costly procedure. There was a systematic review of literature to understand the survival outcome of patients with cervical cancer with hydronephrosis. The conclusion was there is limited, it remains unclear whether treatment of obstruction may benefit the patient at all. So depending on the goals of care of the patient and whether the patient is going to receive any further disease-directed management, we need to discuss everything with the patient and then only decide of undergoing a stent or a nephrostomy. Other studies have also not really shown to improve the survival or the quality of life post procedures. However, it can be done to just decrease the symptom at that point. moving on to the third topic, that is hemorrhagic cystitis. So hemorrhagic cystitis is defined as diffuse inflammatory condition of the urinary bladder due to infection or non-infectious etiology resulting in bleeding from the bladder mucosa. Hemorrhagic cystitis occurs in about 40 to 70% of patients exposed to high-dose cyclophosphamide or ifosfamide chemotherapy, and in up to 15% of patients who undergo pelvic irradiation to treat malignancy. Some of the risk factors for hemorrhagic cystitis includes infection, viral, fungal, or parasite, most commonly seen post stem cell transplants. The other conditions include chemical exposures involving drugs like cyclophosphamide, ifosfamide, pelvic radiation, and some of the rare causes involve medications like penicillamide, bleomycin, allopurinol, acetic acid. Some systemic disease like amyloidosis and rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease can also lead to hemorrhagic cystitis. Chemotherapeutic agents that can cause hemorrhagic cystitis, cyclophosphamide is the most common, ifosfamide after that, sulfan, thiotropine, doxorubicin, mitomycin, and temozolomide. Now, hemorrhagic cystitis is graded by Roller et al. As 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 is non-visible hematuria. 2 is macroscopic hematuria. 3 is macroscopic hematuria with small clots. And 4 is gross hematuria with clots causing urinary tract obstruction requiring instrumental evacuation. Now, the RTOG has classified the hematuria differently based on the epithelial atrophy and the telangiectasis status. What is the mechanism of hemorrhagic cystitis post-radiation? So the bladder is made of 4 layers, that is the urothelium, the lamina propria, the diffusor muscle, and the connective tissue. Post-radiation in acute phase, that is in weeks, there is loss of the glycoaminoglycan layer in the bladder. There is loss of urothelial cells. There is inflammation, edema, dilation of the blood vessel, and urine leakage. After months to years, this radiation causes end arthritis and urothelial proliferation and leaky urothelium. In late phase, that is chronic, that is after years, there is increase in collagen deposit, decrease in smooth muscle cells, end arthritis, fibroblast infiltration, hemorrhage, and inflammation. Why does chemotherapy cause hemorrhagic cystitis? So cyclophosphamide is the most common cause. It is urotoxic because it is metabolized in the liver to form acrolein, which is excreted in the urine, and this acrolein is actually bladder toxic. Ifosfamide hemorrhagic cystitis is more severe, and it is related to release of human necrotic factor and interleukin-1 beta, mediating the release of nitric oxide and leading to hemorrhagic cystitis. The other cause includes viral bladder infiltration, mostly post stem cell transplant. The organisms involved are E. coli, adenovirus 7, 11, 21, 35, papovirus, and influenza A virus. Symptoms of hemorrhagic cystitis include dysuria, that is pain or burning while passing urine, unable to empty the bladder, loss of bladder continence, urinary frequency and urgency, getting up multiple times at night to urinate, fatigue due to anemia, pain in the lower abdomen above the pubic area. The management includes in grade 1 and 2 when the hematuria is microscopic. We can just hydrate And if it is post chemotherapy, we can increase the dose of Mesna and repeat the urine routine micro 4 to 6 weeks. In grade 3 and 4, when the hematuria is gross, we need to check for the complete blood count to look at the hemoglobin status. We need to look at the serum creatinine level, the coagulation parameter. We need to do a urine culture here to look for any bacterial or viral cause. If the diagnosis is in question, the patient presents with hematuria, then we need to do a upper and a lower urinary tract sonogram or CT and look for pelvic masses or bladder infiltration. Cystoscopy is indicated to localize the bleeding. The Canadian Urological Association has given us a way in which we can manage this patient. So the first step is to make sure that the bladder is not over distended because of the clot. So we need to put a catheter. Initial irrigation through the catheter should ideally be performed using sterile water because water can help in lysing the red blood cells and in lysing the clots. Then we need to put a 3-way catheter, and continuous bladder irrigation can then be started with saline after we have evacuated the clots using this sterile water. Now, when we have started bladder irrigation, we also need to maintain intravenous fluid hydration to prevent dehydration in these patients. Mesna is the drug that we give along with urotoxic chemotherapic agents like cyclophosphamide and ifosfamide. Mesna binds to the acrolein, which is the product formed post cyclophosphamide administration, and this creates a stable thioester compound, and there is decreased risk of bladder toxicity. If this is preventive measure, Mesna is used as prevention. If the patient has already developed hemorrhagic cystitis, we need to use some astringent like alum. Alum works by precipitating over the bleeding surface of the bladder wall. If 1% alum solution that contains 50 grams of alum is dissolved in the 5-liter bag of sterile water, and irrigation of the bladder is started at the rate of 200 to 300 ml per hour. The other astringent that can be used is silver nitrate. Again, it forms a bladder coating. The concentration used is 0.5 to 1%, and it is instilled for 10 to 20 minutes, causing chemical coagulation and eschar formation over the bleeding site. The other medications that can be used are estrogen analogs. This decreases the fragility of the mucosal microvasculature. Surgical intervention other than cystoscopy involves cauterization of the bleeding vessels. If most of the interventions have failed, selective hypogastric branch artery embolization, that is transarterial embolization, can be considered. In severe cases, urinary diversions with or without cystostomy should be considered, but it is a highly morbid procedure. While choosing any of these management, again, since it's our scenario, we need to discuss with the patient the goals of care. Urinary diversion and cystostomy may not be something that is advisable in patients who present with advanced illness who are ECOG 2 or ECOG 3 or 4. Along with the above management, we need to manage the symptoms because hemorrhagic cystitis can involve a lot of discomfort and pain. So anticholinergic and antispasmodic drugs can help in limiting the discomfort and reducing the frequency and urgency associated with radiation cystitis. The other option is hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So, hyperbaric oxygen therapy has been shown to have moderate effectiveness in patients with hemorrhagic cystitis. It works by promoting granulation tissue formation and neovascularization to cause vasoconstriction. Treatment involves 100% oxygenation for 90 minutes, 5 times weekly. On an average, 40 sessions are given to these patients. Contraindication involves active cancer, active viral infection, pneumothorax, treatment with cisplatin, and any ear reconstruction surgery history. So hyperbaric oxygen may not be feasible in our setup. Sorry, I'm not able to make it as full screen, but this is a chart showing how to manage the hematuria based on the causes. So if the cause is tumor infiltration, we can use medications like alum, and chemotherapy or radiation therapy is feasible. If nothing works, then internal iliac artery embolization. If the cause is radiation cystitis, alum cannot be used in patients who have poor renal functions like increased creatinine. So here, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, if available and if feasible, or again, arterial embolization. If it's cyclophosphamide induced, prevention with mesna, alum again, and HBOT if feasible. Other causes like viral and bacterial infection, we need to manage according to the culture. This is about hemorrhagic cystitis. Few of the take-home messages here is management of AKI and obstructive uropathy, also hemorrhagic cystitis. In our setup should be done based on goals of care of the patient, because these three things are such that it may or may not be reversible in all the cases, and most of the management are aggressive and requires intervention. So it should always be discussed with the patient and the family, and we need to tell them about the pros and cons of every management. It is not like patients who are on palliative care should not be referred to other super specialists. So, or at a timely referral to nephrologist whenever required when the patient presents to us with AKI or obstructive uropathy should be done. Again, based on the goals of care of the patient. There is no clear guideline to decide whether a percutaneous nephrostomy or a stenting should be done in patients with advanced cancer who have hydrouronephrosis. This decision is based on clinicians and patients' goals of care, and after discussing the pros and cons with the family and the patient. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shamili. That was a detailed description. Now, any questions, Arun?
No questions yet. Okay, we are getting questions. Hold on. One question from Dr. Vikas Anand. I don't understand the question. So Vikas, maybe you can be a bit more clear. So the question says, can you please explain how water is superior than normal saline in irrigation of obstructive uropathy?
So that irrigation was actually for hematuria, not obstructive uropathy. So what water is hypotonic solution. So and saline is hypertonic. So when we use a hypotonic solution, it is absorbed in the clots and the cells that cause, so when because of osmosis, that are osmotic rule. So hypotonic say it is absorbed in the cells and the clots. This causes expansion of the cells and the clot and eventually lysis of the cells and the clot. And this lysis can, when the clots and cells are lysed, it can be easily removed through the catheter. So that is why water is better than normal saline for irrigation, bladder irrigation.
Thank you. If there are any more questions, kindly post it because it's almost time. Okay. More questions coming your way. Dose of Mesna in preventing hemorrhagic cystitis, and how and when should it be started? Before
Mesna is given based on the body surface area calculation. It is best we discuss this with the treating oncologist. This is I don't think it should just be our decision to start Mesna because the dosing is very it's very meticulous. So it is available as 400 mg tablet. The dosing is usually 480 mg per meter square, so based on body surface area, and it is calculated based on the dose of chemotherapy that the patient is requiring. So definitely we'll need help of an oncologist here. It is usually given after 6 hours of chemotherapy and repeated after 12 hours of chemotherapy. So 480 mg per meter square is the dose.
Thank you. More questions, please, for Shamli, if you have some.
Yes, Mesna is usually given along with chemotherapy.
Shamli, is Mesna also available intravenously?
Yes, ma'am. It's either intravenous or oral.
Yeah, so the option of giving it intravenously is also available.
Yes, ma'am.
That was a very interesting and very clear, detailed description of the basic 3 complications that we come across. Any other questions, Arun?
No, we don't have any more questions. I am waiting. There are no more questions at the moment.
So I think we will call it a day a little early today for once, maybe. And thank Dr. Shamli. Thank you, Shamli. Over to Nisha. Is that it?
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.